Tell me a little bit about your ministry, Ted. I'm speaking with Ted Wright of Epic Archaeology. Tell me a little bit about your ministry. Tell me a little bit about your background, and tell me a little bit about why you think archaeology is important for Christians.
Well, Matt, thanks for having me on. Yeah, so I started Epic Archaeology about it's going on 3 years now. Well, this coming spring will be 3 years. So we started it on we launched it officially on Easter Sunday morning of 2017 because, of course, that's when Christians around the world celebrate the resurrection, and the resurrection is the foundation of our faith. But the reason why I started it is several different reasons. Number one, I have a training background, a master's degree in apologetics, and my area of expertise or specialty is in biblical archaeology. One of the problems, though, Matt, that I've seen is that there's a lot of great stuff in archaeology, but it's not really translated very well. It really doesn't come across to the average churchgoer. You know, it's the guy, the grandmother going to church, or the church folks going to Sunday school, whatever. So I wanted to have a website not only to communicate what some of the amazing discoveries that we found that actually show the biblical record is historically reliable, but also to defend the faith to those who have questions about, well, is there any evidence that this ever actually happened? And really, that's the main thrust of Epic Archaeology is, of course, you were in Birmingham, but I went to Mississippi State, so don't hold that against me. But my undergrad in archaeology was at Mississippi State University, and even though it is in the Bible Belt in the South, we had a couple of professors who were very skeptical about the historical record of the Bible, and they didn't believe it was actually historically accurate. So that's really the seedbed of when I began to connect the dots and wanted to try to find out if there's any historical and archaeological evidence for these stories that I'd read about my whole life. And I wanted to know, did these things actually happen? Is there any evidence that they happen? So that led me to apologetics, which then led me to biblical archaeology. And so I started Epic Archaeology also for people like myself who may have heard stories in the Bible, and now they maybe have had a liberal professor, or maybe watched a documentary on History Channel or Discovery Channel, and these professors, these egghead professors, are saying, well, you know, this never happened or whatever. But I want to have a resource where they can go to find out what historical evidences that we do have for the biblical record. And I got to say, Matt, I mean, I taught undergrad archaeology, and I've taught just a little bit of seminary biblical archaeology and apologetics, and I got to say, for about 15, 16 years. And the deeper I've gotten into it, the more amazed I have been. And we live in an amazing time today because there's so much more information coming out of the ground, and it's even more amazing and more reliable than we could have ever imagined. I mean, we all believe that by faith, but now we've got some really hard evidence to back it up.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, so every year they have the Evangelical Theological Society, and that's something in the Evangelical Philosophical Society. It wasn't until last year that I went with our friend Doug Powell, and Doug is like, there's a society that meets a bunch of guys who love archaeology. Why don't you come to this side of the convention, and I want to introduce you to a whole network of nerds, And I went, and I was fascinated because I always knew that there was biblical archaeology and that went on, but these guys, I mean, they really knew their stuff.
Yeah, a lot of my colleagues are there. Yeah, the Ancient Near Eastern Archaeological Society. Yes,
that's it. And
yes.
And you kind of think, okay, archaeology, the way that it's presented in church is kind of ham-fisted. Who knows if it's really true or not? But when you go and listen to people like you or these guys speak, you're like, oh, these aren't just Christian archaeologists. These are real, honest to goodness archaeologists that can stand probably toe to toe with anybody else when it comes to evidences. I even saw a little disagreement, like a heated disagreement in the room. And I love this kind of stuff, by the way, over like dates, right? And these two guys were going after it when it came to dates. And this guy was like, "You're not right." This guy, and I thought, man, this is the only kind of place where this stuff is significant and has real meaning. So, exactly. I mean, is that true? I mean, this is what I guess what you're trying to do with your ministry is to tell people, listen, we're doing really good archaeology as Christians.
Absolutely, Matt. And you touched on something that is critically important when it comes to finding or discovering evidence, historical and archaeological evidence for the biblical record, and that is chronology and timing, dating. I wrote an article called "The Backbone of History" for our website, epicarchaeology.org, that folks can go to Epic Archaeology, click on blog, and they can find it. But essentially, what the article says is that when an event happened, when we think it happened, is important for helping us discover where it actually happened in the archaeological record. And there are a couple of heated areas even among evangelical archaeologists over the dating of certain events. And a couple of those are, the most important one probably in the Old Testament is the dating of the Exodus, and the second one is the conquest. But as James Hoffmeyer says, he's up here in the upper Midwest, an archaeologist. He says that the Exodus and conquest stand or fall together. So wherever we place the date of the Exodus, the conquest must follow about 40 or so years after that. And so we can plug those purported dates into the archaeological record to see if we actually do have evidence for that. And of course, I have an opinion about this as well, and so do my colleagues. But years ago, there was a really interesting book written by Professor William Deaver, retired now from the University of Arizona. And Bill Deaver's book really pinpoints the nature of this whole debate about biblical archaeology. What did the biblical writers know, and when did they know it? So important, because I mean that question really cuts to the heart of the whole debate about, are the biblical writers just making stories up after they happened, or maybe they never happened and they're just saying it, or were they eyewitnesses of it? That's a critically important question. But I got to say, I believe we've got some really strong evidence that all of it happened.
Yeah, I even this year I watched. Of course, it was online. There was a whole special session on Sodom. That was just so incredibly fascinating. I have a friend of mine who's a pretty big theologian, teaches in the area. Is one of the smartest guys that I know. He said biblical archaeology is one of those things that almost sucked him into a vortex, because he said he loves philosophy, but there was something tangibly just incredible about archaeology. He says, I understand why people get lost in it. And I totally understand why you're so passionate and lost in it as well. And I'm just a layman, right? So, but let's get to why, I'd love to have you on more, as a guest, because I want to promote your work. But I wanted to bring you on to talk, to kind of almost give people kind of an idea of how this works. We did this with Doug Powell last year, but the Bible itself and its story is just, it's not just a super myth, right? And myth I'm not using myth in the sense of Lewis using myth. I just mean the myth that most people think, that it's a fairy tale, that it's something that it's a story that makes people feel happy. In fact, if you look at some areas, especially in the New Testament and the Gospels, it is rooted in history and testable history. And no other time is that even more apparent than in the Christian, the birth of Christ narrative. The nativity of Jesus Christ. I mean, you start reading these stories, and there's these little, there's a person here, or a place here, or something else that we can go and test. You can go and excavate. So let's break down the story a little bit, because I know you have a couple of things that you're writing that we're going to post and try to retweet. What are some kind of the key points in the nativity where you yourself can go and say, we can test this?
Well, I mean, you touched on it, Matt, and that is in the Gospel of Luke. Actually, let me turn my email off because it'll be blinging. But in the Gospel of Luke, Luke actually gives us, and if you read the account, he gives us historical markers, things that you can actually go. In fact, he says it in chapter 1 that he wanted to carefully investigate those things. Interesting, the word investigate is the same word for history. The Greek word historia means investigation. It doesn't mean myth. So Herodotus, the Greek writer, Herodotus is the one who we think coined the term history. But Luke, and the gospel writer Luke, of course, wrote not only the Gospel of Luke, but he also wrote the book of Acts as well. But he gives us in Luke chapter 2, I mean, really specific historical markers that you can actually go and investigate. So, this is not like Tolkien writing Lord of the Rings, and the land of Gondor, this is like, you can actually go and with a shovel and a spade and go dig this stuff up. He says, and it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. The census took place while Quirinius was governing Syria, so all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth to Judea, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David. So right there in the jump, you've got several names that were thrown out, several historical events that were thrown out. And one of the things, and let me just sort of back up a little bit before we get into it. And this is something that I teach, the way I teach it at Epic Archaeology, is that it's an important question. It seems like a sort of benign question to talk about, but it's a really important question before we get into looking at, because I could give you the reason and give you the answer, but I want people to know why we think this is the case, not we're just making it up. So here's the question, and then we'll get into some of the evidences that we looked at. And I've got some really cool stuff to share, some new stuff that I actually just learned myself in the past several months. I interviewed Professor Jody Magnus at UNC Chapel Hill. She is one of the top, I would say probably one of the top New Testament archaeologists in the world, if not in the country, if not in the United States. She's also a colleague of Bart Ehrman, by the way, at UNC Chapel Hill. But anyway, I'll share with you some stuff that Jody shared with me. In fact, she sent me your article it's about Herod the Great. But so here's the question. How do we know the past first? That's a fundamental question. How do we even, I mean, most people just sort of jump and want to know the archaeological evidence, and there is good archaeological evidence. But the first question we need to ask is, well, how do we even know the past to begin with? Because we live in an internet, Twitter world, Instagram, social media, and in our modern mind, it's sort of, we don't think in those terms. We just think soundbite, the kind of thing. But if you're an academic historian or an archaeologist, you have to ask the academic question: how do we even know the past? If something happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 2,000 years ago, how do we even have knowledge of that? Is it just somebody's, invention? So again, I'm going to summarize it in a way that some academics probably won't like, but it's actually holds true, I think. And that is that we know the past through what we call primary sources. And there are three essential primary sources for ancient history or any history. And they are, number one, eyewitnesses; number two, historical records; and number three, archaeological evidence. So you have eyewitnesses, someone who actually had to have seen the event and live through it in order for us to have knowledge of it. Because there could be a lot of events, but unless a person saw it, then they wrote it down. They wrote it either in a journal or an article or a book or whatever the case may be, a manuscript, an inscription, whatever the case may be. And then we've got the archaeological evidence. The problem, though, is that, and to give you a modern analogy of that, we could say, there's several different examples, but for time, I'll give you one example, and that is my grandfather. Back when I was a kid, we would always go to my grandparents for Thanksgiving, and for whatever reason, it was in Arkansas, actually, which is normally warm in November in Arkansas, but inevitably it would always be cold. My grandfather liked building fires, and so he would build this big roaring fire in the fireplace, and we'd back up to the fireplace, and he would tell us stories about being in the war. And as a kid, I thought, well, I don't know what war he was in. I had no idea. But he talked about crossing the English Channel, and his hands being cold and having to get out on the beach with his gun and all that. Come to find out, my grandfather was on D-Day. I mean, he drove a Higgins boat on D-Day, June 6, 1944. So my grandfather was an eyewitness to D-Day. Now, several years ago, he passed away, and my grandmother gave me a lot of his old stuff because she knew that I loved hearing stories about my grandfather in D-Day. So he has this book that actually has all his record of where he was, when he was there. It had photographs in it. They actually had pictures of a captured German torpedo boat. They had pictures of him in his landing barge, like Saving Private Ryan, all that kind of stuff. So we have now historical record. So my grandfather would be the eyewitness. His diary in his little Blue Jackets manual, that would be the historical record. And then the archaeological evidence, we could actually go to Normandy. We can go to the coast of Normandy, and we can actually find, still to this day, concrete reinforced German positions on the sides of the banks of Normandy. So we have these three things working together. We have an eyewitness account, my grandfather telling me a story. Now he could have made it up, but then he has the historical record. And now we've got the archaeological record, in which we can compare to see if the archaeological record actually matches what we actually see in my grandfather's writings. But here's the thing about the historical records also, Matt, and that is that not only did my grandfather have an account of being on D-Day, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other eyewitness accounts of other soldiers besides my grandfather. And then also on the other side, this gets into something Mike Licona talks about when he talks about historiography, and that is what we want is we want multiple attestation and we want enemy attestation. We want people who were not even friendly to whatever it is we're talking about, and that would be in the World War II example. It would be like the Germans. These allies, they came across the English Channel, they kept coming and they kept coming, and they're writing about it. So their accounts also match. So all of that, we've kind of dove into the idea of historiography and how it is that we know the past. So when people today read the Christmas story, it's supposedly written by an eyewitness, Luke, or maybe he interviewed eyewitnesses, and so we can't interview him. He's long gone. So the only thing we have is the historical record in the New Testament, and we have the archaeological record. And the period in which the New Testament says Jesus was born is a period that we know of very well in ancient history. In fact, it blows, to be honest with you, it just boggles my mind how people could be Jesus mythicists, because it is one of the most well attested periods in ancient history. The early Roman Empire, in which you've got Julius Caesar, and then you've got Octavius Augustus, who comes on in 31 BC, becomes the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. And Luke tells us, it says, and it came to pass in the days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. So we begin the Christmas story with the existence of Caesar Augustus. We know him very well. There's so many, gosh, it's like this is so rich and there's so much stuff. So you asked me a totally loaded question. We could be days, but let me just say this. I wrote an article that I personally like, just because I like the subject. It was an event that was recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus, and it happened in 9 AD. Jesus would have been, according to some of the chronology that I follow, Jesus would have been approximately 5 or 6 years old. But there were 3 Roman legions that were completely annihilated in Germany by a Germanic guy who was captured, and he was sort of a spy in the Roman army, and he ambushed 3 Roman legions in a place called the Teutoburg Forest in Germany. And this happened during the end of the reign of Octavius Caesar. And so Tacitus records this. But he also records events about the early church, and Gary Habermas talks a lot about this in a lot of his writings. That there are 15 historical facts that we can learn about the life of Christ just from Tacitus. So in the article, it's called "Tacitus and the Lost Legions of Varus." It's on Epic Archaeology, and people can read about that. But I make the connection between the fact that if Tacitus can record accurate history and the archaeology can back it up, he also records about what was going on in Palestine in the first century. So even we don't even have the archaeology, we just got Tacitus, but the archaeology does back up Tacitus. And again, nobody doubts that Augustus lived. That's not even up for debate. So we begin there, and there's good evidence for that. And then the Census of Quirinius. And that's the second thing we can look at. And we also have another article on Epic Archaeology, which people could check out on the Census of Quirinius. But there are a couple of different options. Depends on who you ask. I know that Gleason Archer, Old Testament scholar from years ago, resolved the issue one way. Some scholars today resolve it another way. But essentially, the census definitely took place. We know about Quirinius. Josephus writes about him. Tacitus writes about him. We know that he lived. There are some chronological issues. But one thing I'll tell you, Matt, the one way we can actually affirm that this event happened is, number one, we know that there was a guy named Quirinius who was governing Syria. There's no direct evidence of a census at that time, but we do know that the Romans did take censuses. In fact, there's some evidence that they took it every 14 years. And so there's either multiple censuses that were going on, and Luke mentions the first one, whereas Josephus mentions the second one, or there were 2 people named Quirinius, and that's not impossible. But the view that I hold to actually follows from a New Testament scholar by the name of Jack Finnegan. And Jack Finnegan, brilliant guy. He is a biblical chronologist, and he's really wrote some great stuff. But he actually mentions this really cool discovery that was made. In 1784, there was a Latin inscription discovered near Tivoli, Italy, about 20 miles south of Rome. It's known as the Lapis Tyburnius, Tiburtinus inscription. And this contains a statement of a high Roman official that when he became governor of Syria, he entered the office for the second time. It's even thought that the person may have been Quirinius. So this is possible that Quirinius served as governor twice, which would also explain the census. So again, the census is certainly plausible. It's in the historical record. We know that Romans did do censuses, so that makes sense. So that's just the starters. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions at this point.
No, there is a whole bunch that we could talk about here. I'm amazed when you just slow down, because we quickly read through this, especially during Christmas. But if you slow these things down, if you slow sentence by sentence and just read it, there's no reason why Luke had to add all this information, other than he's probably telling you how they got to Bethlehem, why they're in Bethlehem. And right. if we have somebody like in our apologetic world called Lydia McGrew. Tim and Lydia always talk about the undesigned coincidences.
That's right.
There's a little bit of a UC here, because you think even in Matthew when you talk about when the wise men visit, they go and visit because they don't know where he's going to be at. But the people in Jerusalem, the ones who would have known better, said, well, the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. So, we know that Jesus, it was important for all different reasons for why the Messiah to come from that city. And now we know that Luke has given us historical reasons why they went to the city. So right. you're seeing how these, you said attestations, these different gospel narratives are helping each other out, and it's not, they just don't throw this out there to throw it out there. There's a reason why he was in. There's a biblical reason and a prophetic reason why the Messiah comes from Bethlehem, but there's also historical reasons how he got there. It's just like you said, It's so fun to know that this is a great myth in the Lewis sense, but also a great historical event that worked in real time. And to me, I think that's incredible.
Right. Yeah, what makes Jesus so different than Thor or Zeus is that you can actually go to Israel and you can go investigate all these things, and you can see where he was, you can see where he walked, you can go to Caesarea and see where they found the Pontius Pilate inscription. You can go to Capernaum and you can actually see where you can see the synagogue that Jesus actually taught in. You can walk on the same stones that he walked on. So it's not as the gospel writer said, we're not following cleverly devised myths. We were eyewitnesses of his. They're claiming to be eyewitnesses. And again, to the skeptic out there, it's like, well, they're making it up. But again, what I would respond to is that why would they make it up? These are just benign historical references that you can actually go check out. And so that's one of the functions. And if I haven't said it, let me just say this, that where I see archaeology dovetail with apologetics is archaeology can function in one of three ways, or sometimes all three together. Number one, archaeology can affirm the historical basis of the text, the Bible. Number two, it can illuminate the world of the Bible, and it can also clarify certain passages in the text. So clarify, affirm, and illuminate. And for most sort of liberal-leaning scholars, they look at archaeology more in the illuminative sense. They look at it as that, well, it just helps us to understand the Old Testament or the New Testament world, and that's true. And it's very helpful when it comes to exegetical questions and certain interpretive issues, hermeneutical issues. I'll give you one example. There are several, but one example that I really find fascinating is, actually two from the Exodus. One is in the third commandment. In Exodus chapter 20, of course, the first three commandments: no other gods before me, make no graven images, and number three is do not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So several years ago, when I was teaching an Old Testament survey, I was going through my notes and I was getting ready to teach this, like the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and in the context of ancient Egypt, because if we believe that the Israelites were actually in Egypt, that they were just made up, they were actually living in Egypt for 400 years. And the other thing too is that when Moses in Exodus 3, when he is before the burning bush, and and he doesn't even know God's name, because when I go back to the Israelites, and I tell them that you sent me, what do I tell them? What is your name? He didn't even know his name. So I'm thinking, how could they have violated the third commandment if they didn't even know his name, if they barely even knew his name? So I was like, there's got to be something. And then I came across a really cool book written by John Currid called Ancient Egypt in the Old Testament. And it just blew my mind. And he talks about polemical theology, and which is another subject I won't get into. But basically, essentially what's going on is this, that in ancient Egypt, the Egyptians had household gods. And we know very, very likely, in fact, we know it from the text. It's not just something that we just conjecture about. We can see it in the text itself in the Old Testament. The Israelites had become thoroughly paganized in Egyptian culture. They had absorbed Egyptian gods. They believed in Egyptian gods. They worshiped Egyptian gods. How do we know this? Well, as soon as Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, they're worshiping a golden calf. They're giving the golden calf the credit for their deliverance and not God. So the first three commandments all are rooted in the context of ancient Egypt. Number one, there are no other gods except me. The Egyptians had multiple gods. So he's telling the Israelites, listen, I am the only one. There are no others. Number two, no graven images. You can't form me. I'm not a snake. I'm not a falcon. I'm not this. I am a spirit, and I am created all things. And number three is the interesting one. And that is, when these Egyptians had their household gods, they could invoke the name of that. There was a magical name of the Egyptian god. And when they said the magical name and they invoked the name of Isis or Osiris, then the magical name, that god had to do whatever the person asked. And so I think what the third commandment's basically saying is God saying, listen, I don't play that game. You can't just invoke my name and I just come running and give you what you want, which is actually even more powerful. And you think about it, because, when we think about violating the third commandment, we think about saying God's name with a curse word, but it actually is it's tougher than that, because we do that a lot. We just sort of think we can just throw God's name out there and he can give us what we want. But God says, listen, there's no one like me. You can't put me in a category of any other gods. I do what I want. It's my will, not your will. So you can't just invoke my name. So this is where, and we wouldn't know that apart from Egyptology. We would not know that apart from studying archaeology and the archaeology of ancient Egypt. So ancient Egypt archaeology gives us insight. It clarifies the text. Now you can read that, and as an English reader, and you can understand it, and you can completely take truth away from it. But when you understand the historical context, then it really becomes very powerful. And that's one of the very powerful tools of archaeology. So one of my crusades in Epic Archaeology is to get Christians to read their Bibles deeper, in a deeper way, and to show how archaeology not only is it just a checklist of, oh, we found this, we found this, we found this, but also archaeology gives us some amazing insights into the ancient world of the biblical writers.
Yeah, it's those aha moments, right? That's what I talk about. I watch you guys work, and I talk to friends that are involved in it, and they're constantly having these. You said illuminate the text. I always talk to my students and say it puts the text in high definition. We're able to see things that you weren't able to see before. And you get real passionate, don't you, when you have these, you go to a place and you just have this aha moment. There's something about that maybe you could tell me, because you probably had more than me. These people that go to the Holy Land, then they come back just incredibly charged, right? You have those type people. We've had events before where we've had the Shroud of Turin replica of it, and then people go see it. And we've connected it with, we'd have Dr. Gary Habermas, he'd come talk about the Shroud. Just kind of a way to get people to come and talk about the resurrection. But when they see it, we've had people come and look at the Shroud, and they're like, oh, wow, that could be the face of Jesus. Something happens. I'm not saying their faith is not warranted, but when it gets clued into an historical reality, something happens, doesn't it?
Yep, it does. Yes, absolutely. It's there's a connection. I think it comes back to the way God has hardwired us. And one of the things I love about your ministry, Tactical Faith, and it's something that we try to do as well at Epic Archaeology, and that is that faith and reason are complementary, and that it's those moments when you have that aha moment you're talking about, is when your faith is, then you can see the foundation. You normally can't see the foundation of it because you believe, you trust based on authority of Scripture, based on the authority of God's word. But when you actually see the evidence and you see it written in marble, Pontius Pilate's name, it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
what you believe is right. You're
Huh.
good. You're good. And and it's just amazing. Your faith has now become sight. And Aquinas would say, then your faith it's not faith anymore. It's the knowledge, but still faith. And I will say this, that archaeology, even though we've got amazing evidences, there is still plenty of room for faith. And
For sure.
one of the things I've heard people say is that, well, you're just trying to prove it. No, archaeology can't prove anything. Whenever we talk about proof, I usually think of it in a mathematical sense or a logical sense. And we're not talking about like a deductive syllogism. Archaeology is sort of an inductive science. It is an inductive science, and it's based on probability. So we have higher degrees of probability and we have lower degrees of probability. But I would say overall, when we look at all of it together, it provides a very firm case that the biblical record is reliable.
Yeah, and it's interesting that we all function that way, Christians and unbelievers, that in the sense that we all are made for a grand narrative. We're all wanting to be a part of some grand narrative that we want to know that's real. I mean, this was Lewis when he said, I finally found out that, Christianity, was real in the sense that it was the great myth. It was the story of all stories. And one of the things I find funny is on YouTube, me and my kids watch YouTube. We don't watch TV anymore. We watch YouTube, right? That's what everybody does. There's like this cottage industry of people that go around to find the places where films were made, right? Oh, here's a place where these are places where Back to the Future was actually made. And one of the things that I've noted with my children are that look how these people are so passionate about a story that they know is blatantly false, but they're passionate about it. So in other words, when they go to these places that they've seen on screen of a movie that they have incredible passion about, in a way, they're doing the function of an archaeologist. Here's something that happened in real life. The tragedy is they know it's not a real story.
That's
yet
right.
They're passionate about it. What's so great about Christianity is it is an incredible story, but it's an incredible story that we, like you said, can go to the places where it actually happened, and it happens to actually be true. And those, and that's why I feel like even during Christmas time, it's an incredible opportunity to share your faith. It's an incredible opportunity to be passionate again about your faith, because this is not just a story. This is not a movie. This is a real life event that has real like implications on us all. And thank you so much for the ministry that you do. And I hope, Ted, that we can come on and promote it and talk about it. And, this is just the start of many times where you can come on.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit before we go, a little bit about, you've already said about your website. Tell me, are you on Facebook or on social media?
Oh, yeah. So people can check us out. It's epicarchaeology.org is the website. And we have got a little bit of maintenance we need to do. We need to update some things, but they can find blog articles. And then also, if you're in the Chicagoland area, whenever things open back up, I actually lead tours through the Oriental Institute Museum at the University of Chicago, which is probably one of the greatest archaeological museums in the country. The OI has been doing archaeology in the Near East for about 100 years now. It was founded by James Henry Breasted, and I found out about a year or so ago that Gleason Archer actually used to lead tours through the Oriental Institute. So I thought, man, I'm geeking out because I'm totally a Gleason Archerite, and he's a great guy. But so if you're in the Chicago area, I lead tours through Oriental Institute Museum. We also have YouTube channel, Epic Archaeology YouTube. We have a podcast called Monocle and Spade, in which we explore the world of the Bible and beyond through the lens of history and archaeology. We've got about 7 or 8 podcasts right now. They're on YouTube. We're trying to get them updated to iTunes so people can listen just audio version. We're also on Instagram and Facebook. Follow us on Facebook. We post most of our stuff on Facebook. So people can check us out there as well.
Oh, well, again, thank you for what you do. We're going to put all this information on the show notes for people, and we're going to start posting some of your stuff on Tactical Faith just to get them to link to your website for the people of Alabama. But oh man, Chicago is one of my wife's favorite cities, so we're definitely going to come up there and do that tour with my kids, because I think that would be great. Well, much love to you, and much love to your ministry, and
Thank you, brother.
We will get to you in the future. God bless.
Sounds good. Merry Christmas. God bless.